Hello, I'm Susan Corbett, a custom machine quilter, and what I have for you today is a big block of the month called Garden Party Down Under. This quilt is for show. I doubt it'll get a lot of use in its life, but it might. The client asked me for show quilting, but we're not going to go all the way out. This quilt is 73 by 73 inches. So I was thinking, well, it's not that big. It won't be an arduous task. But that's still a lot of quilt. And it seemed to me like the more I quilted, the more there was to quilt. So even not going all out, this was still pretty involved. So as with all I do, first we stabilize. That means quilting in the ditch, around borders and piecing, maybe not every inch of it, but a whole bunch. And also outlining right around the edges of the appliqué. And there's a lot of appliqué in this quilt. So I'm not the kind of quilter who is going to quilt all of the quilt from the top down. I'm going to stabilize first and then go back and pick out what parts I want to work on based on where the fullness is in a quilt sometimes, or if I don't know how I'm going to quilt a certain part of it, I'll let that slide and start with the parts that I do know. And I'm not showing you the quilting all in perfect order. Let's start with the medallion here. There's a lot of parts to this quilt. So one of the features of the medallion is, gosh, look at all those berries. I would never have attempted such a quilt because I don't like appliquing berries. Mine never come out round. They're always pointy. And a word about the appliqué here. It's pretty darn good, which is what you need for it to be if if you want this quilt to show well and really get you some results. Your skill level needs to be way up there. And so the appliqué here is pretty darn good. Not in every bit of it, but in a lot of it, she's used a stabilizer. So some parts of the quilt got quilted pretty sparsely just because of that. Some parts are already kind of thick and puffy. So we'll want to quilt lightly on the appliqué, but the appliqué was quilted. So let me say right here and now. Here you see this vase that's unquilted, but there's a lot of vases in here, and for at least half of them, I think I wanted a specific motif, and probably stuff I couldn't freehand. So I went online and bought some digital patterns, and they're all geometric because I thought geometrics were what this quilt was going to want. And I asked the client, would you like straight or round? What's your preference? And she said, definitely round. So since there weren't going to be a lot of straight lines in the white space, and there's a lot of white space here, I thought, well, let's work it in wherever we can. So I had the computer quilt all kinds of cool patterns in the vases. And all the rest of it is going to be freehand or ruler work. All right, so let's say all the stabilizing has been done. The medallion was not where I started quilting. I started putting flowers in all over the place, and I attacked the backgrounds for those as well. And there's a lot of it. And after a while, I got really sick of what I was doing. So I wanted there to be something a little bit different in the medallion. I don't want all the quilting to be the exact same thing. all the blocks are, there's piece blocks, there's appliqué, there's all kinds of borders in here. There's a whole lot of things going on. So I want the quilting to be the same way. So the little background quilting around the flowers and such is just arcs, because I wanted to keep it simple, because I knew there was going to be a lot of it, and I wanted that to be simple. And but the smaller it is, the longer it's going to take you to do. And I didn't want more of that in here. So the basic plan is kind of the same, but how it manifested in different areas is different. And what I mean by that is I quilted a variety of flowers and pretty similar background quilting with a few little variations in there. So the background quilting in the medallion is spirals. It's not exactly swirls. You start with a swirl and then you echo it several times. And it kind of reminds me of, when you throw a pebble in the water and it ripples out. That's kind of what this makes me think of. And it's fun. It's so much fun to do. I love it. So I got the top half of the medallion spiraled out, and then when I got to the bottom part, there's a lot more white space down here. So I put a big partial flower behind the vase. Oh, and here you can see one of the digital designs I put in the vase, on the vase. So now I can go back to doing the spirals. The spirals can be larger the more white space you have, but in the little spaces like here, right around the little bits around the berries, those are going to end up being smaller just because you've got less space to work with. And this isn't going to be perfectly straightforward, because how can you quilt a meander like this and control where you're going to end up? So there's a lot of stops and starts here. I got boxed into little corners and I wasn't where I wanted to be, so there was quite a bit of stopping and starting and tying off. But I like the way this is going. So as with all things I do, I like to have a variety of different sizes. So I like that big flower is right there. And I could have put a whole one in there, but I like the idea of a flower peeking out from behind the vase. And that way I can make it much larger than I would have been able to otherwise. I did the stabilizing in clear thread, and I'm doing this quilting right here with So Fine. It's not pure white, but it's almost pure white. And I used Omni by Superior thread for all kinds of other parts in here, for the quilting in the diamonds, on the vases. So there were quite a number of thread color changes. The back is just white fabric, and I did not end up with a picture of that. So it's almost a whole cloth, but there's little bits of colored thread here and there. And the colors, I tried to use, see that patch on the left, the yellow. See, it's a yellowish green sort of color. So I chose that color thread, and I thought I could use that on all over the quilt, which would have been super low contrast on the white back. But no, I had to use some hot pink and purple and blue, and it was all kinds of different colors. So the batting I used was Quilter's Dream wool. Just one layer of Quilter's Dream wool I think is plenty. It's very lofty, and this quilt ended up being pretty heavy. It weighs more than I thought it was going to. The client asked about double batting, but on a quilt this size, I think it would have been ponderously heavy, and I just didn't think we needed it. It was already pretty stable and thick with the stabilizer in it, so I really like what we ended up with. Part of the reason I like quilting with Quilter's Dream wool as opposed to some other wool is it's puffy, and it gives you wonderful texture. I mean, see there on the left how the flowers are really puffing up. It gives you a trapunto effect without having to do any extra work. So that's one of my favorite things to use on appliqué quilts. Well, on any quilt, but especially appliqué, because it helps to feature the appliqué. So I started quilting with the clear, and then I switched to all the colored threads to get those parts quilted first, and then switched to the white so fine to do all the rest of it. I don't like going back and forth. That seems to present confusion when you're working with the thread tension. I like to keep the tension where it is so it stays nice and consistent. And plus, that's kind of the order of things. You stabilize, then you quilt your main motifs, and then you do the background quilting. In this case, when we got to the white fabric, the main motifs in the background were kind of the same thing, except you quilt the flowers first and then you quilt the background. And I did switch back and forth a lot, just depending on where I was for the sake of convenience. And this is one of those meanders, I think. If you wanted some practice, do this over and over and over and over and over. It's fun, as I say, and it's kind of addictive. And you will know how to make some spirals by the time you get through with just even a section this size. Well worth doing. The spirals involve a little bit of backtracking. You might want to rewind this part and slow it down or something and see exactly where that needle is going. And there's a whole bunch of variations depending on if you backtrack or don't. When I got to this part, it made me a lot happier. I wasn't as bored anymore, and I thought, this is going to be cool. I had done, as you can see, quite a bit of the quilting on the surrounding borders, but I was not done. I still had a long way to go. So it's really nice to get to a part where you've got some payoff. That gives you the impetus to keep going. Okay, so let's quilt those diamonds. I had planned to do all sorts of things in there, but then when I saw how the needle felt up against that stabilizer, I simplified this a lot. So what I'm doing here is just, it's inlining. I'm just making more diamonds in the middle with a ruler, with the green thread in some of them. And then quilting over in the middle, or toward the middle rather, see that little line that's going back and forth? That's a little bridge to get you from one place to another, but then what it ends up doing is it makes facets, which I think is exactly what you want here. It's a simple design, it's easy to do. Using the lines on my ruler there to match everything up. You know, you want your diamonds to have facets. So there's, you know, that's all there is to that. Easy, right? Yeah, but there's like 80 diamonds in there. And then in the inner border, there's a whole bunch of half diamonds. So there's a lot, but they went really quickly. Okay, and then there's some pieced blocks in this quilt, and this is one of them with these little 4 patches and the little Dresden plate in the middle. So again, with the green thread, I thought, well, let's just crosshatch it. If we're keeping some of the quilting simple, then a crosshatch was the obvious thing to do there. So you can stop and start all day long in just a 4-patch by cross-hatching it. But in where I could, where I felt comfortable ditch quilting, see right there, in a contrasting thread, it helps to find a sequence that's going to work for you. So I quilted the whole thing in one pass, but that kind of, you have to be able to do some backtracking where it's not going to show. So find the patch where that thread would not call attention to itself. In the other piece block, okay, I ditch quilted around all that piecing, but those little triangles are not big enough to really do much with, so I thought, well, let's just leave those blank. So here, it's the backgrounds that are getting all the attention. So around the plate, where I did no quilting except around that circle and around the perimeter, because those pieces are pretty small, I'm doing flowers and this pattern meander. I wanted something linear in here, but I didn't want to stop and start and, you know, do some slow straight lines and that kind of thing. So the pattern meander seemed to be the way to go. You don't curve the lines except where they change directions. So the lines are straight, and it looks like a straight line design, and they are partially, and that goes really quickly, which is, that's a selling point here. Okay, so here's one of the things, one of the basic decisions you want to make in quilting a quilt like this. See, there's so much shared white space. So what you want to do is decide up front, are all the blocks separate blocks, or is all the white space all one space? And I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. So here what I want to do is direct your attention to where the edge of this block meets up with the diamond border. There is some shared white space. But what can I really do with it? So I think all the white space in this quilt is one space, except for that where these piece blocks meet the diamonds. It just seemed to make sense to wall that off and treat those blocks as separate blocks and treat the border as the border. Where the border meets the appliqué, that's a whole different ballgame. I like to have a rationale for doing what I'm doing. So making those decisions, I don't know, you just kind of have to think it through and decide what are the possibilities and why would I want to do this as opposed to that. Okay, so a word about the flowers. There's a lot of different types in here, and they might all look pretty similar, but there's all kinds of little differences. And why would that be? Well, these flowers, I wanted something rounded because of all the right angles in this block. But there are seams right in the middle. So I don't want to have a flower with a circular center right in the middle of that flower, because then that intersection of the seam is going to pop right up, and that may or may not look good. So these flowers don't have centers. And that lets me be able to quilt that seam right down so it doesn't stick up unattractively. So here, where these two elements meet, I ditch quilted with the white thread, and then I'm just systematically making my way back up to the top with the pattern meander. What makes a pattern meander different from a meander goes in all different directions. A pattern meander goes all in a line, a row. So as long as I'm here, and this is how the white space in the border got quilted, a little bit by a little bit. So I was going to do all kinds of diamonds in here. And then when the client said round, I thought, well, okay, forget that. And then I saw how it was going to just create problems, not solve anything. So I thought, well, let's just echo the diamond once. Twice would have been pretty attractive, but then you'd end up with it, but then you'd end up with this tiny little equilateral triangle at the end, and I wouldn't know what to do with that. So I'm echoing once, and then putting in a little a couple different things happened here. On the outer part of the border, there's a little, I don't know, I did some little bitty flowers with many petals and others with just 3. It's easy to forget what you did at the bottom when you're way up at the top, and that was days ago when you did that part, So I ended up with a lot of different flowers in here. I was trying to keep it really simple and make everything the same, and it just didn't go that way at all. So that 3-petaled flower in there, those could be 3 leaves. I don't know. I don't think it matters. I think it's a cute design and it fits. Looks really good. So the white space around the 4 patches, those are yet again a little bit different. So this block at the bottom of the quilt ended up being quilted a tiny bit differently than at the top, and this is at the top. I did partial flowers in these patches at the bottom. And here I thought, well, let's just use that 3-leaf design. I don't think it's going to look like a mistake. It's just kind of like, I don't even think anybody's going to notice. And then the flower in this part of the block is a little bit different. I think I had rounded petals down below or in some other block, and these are more freeform and pointy, and I think the petals are larger here. I like variety. I don't like the same thing over and over. I get really bored. And there's a whole lot to see in this quilt, so you've got more differences here. I think that's fine. Cute. It was nice to be able to do a little bit of traveling around that Dresden plate. If you start in the middle, it's easy just to quilt right in between the petals to get back up to the top, and then just kind of travel over to the next part. That didn't always end up happening, but that's one tactic for quilting expeditiously. I like the way that's looking. I'm liking it. So, I mean, it's a pretty simple game plan. You know, it's flowers and some background quilting. That's pretty much the whole deal. I kind of feel like I've settled into a formula. I don't want to be a formulaic quilter. That's not what custom quilting is all about. So if I do have a rut that I have sunk into, it's let's do some flowers and some background quilting. But the client was enamored with the final product, and that's the part that matters. So pretty. Okay, so here's the part that this is a slow process. You can't fly around blocks like this and get this quilted in one afternoon. I like to get these little weird spaces in between the applique done first. I guess at the beginning of the quilting process is when I have the patience for a little baby stipple, which I started off doing here. I generally reserve a tiny stipple for tiny spaces where you really can't do much of anything else. And where the spaces get a little bit bigger, then I do want to do something else. But a lot of the time, scale is more important than the design. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter what you put in there. If it's so tiny that that it all runs together and you can't see a pattern. So really what I'm doing in here is just a bunch of little arcs. You know, think of a windshield wiper this way and then that way and then back over here again. If you do any backtracking, then it turns into a little rainbow, or that's when it really starts to turn into a spiral. So what I was doing here was just a baby stipple with some arcs over and over and over. So you arc this way and that way and this way and then change directions. That's what makes it a meander. And that's really fun and satisfying at first, and then you go right to sleep. So I think a good strategy for staying awake and keeping it interesting is to work on this little part and then work on that part over there and then come back over here. This is why in your larger spaces, when you go to put in the flowers first, you know, and then you can do the little background quilting until you have to stop and start in some other place. So when this became even, you know, mind-numbingly tedious and the spaces got bigger, that's where I could add some circles, some berries, some little spirals, some swirls, maybe a little leaf, just so it's not static and dull. Keep that eye moving. Delight the eye as much as possible. So now let's attack some of the larger spaces. Under this vase and between those two groups of flowers coming out of the tall vases, there's ample room here for some big old flowers or something. I have taken great pains in the recording of this, believe it or not, to angle the lights, turn some lights off and focus a light, facing here from the left and that kind of thing, so that you'll be able to see what I'm doing on this white space. It's super easy for it to become a blinding snowstorm, and then you can't see anything. So I hope that was successful, and maybe you want to see this on as big a screen as possible. The great thing about flowers, they're fun to do. Once you get some in your brain and you're no longer afraid of them, you'll see how versatile they are. How you can vary the sizes of the petals so they can, they'll fit into all kinds of different weird spaces. And look at this space. It's an irregular space. So, and plus it's also great fun to do a partial petal where it looks like it's underneath the flower on the left, the appliqué piece. And then, so get most of your flower in, and then finish some background to close off a space. Okay, now you can see the flower. It doesn't have a center, and like a circle or a swirl or something in the very middle. I think in the end I put a little tiny one in there, but that's one of your options. Is it going to be pointy? Are they going to flop around? Is it going to be, is each flower going to have 5 petals? There's all kinds of decisions to get made. And then this space is pretty irregular itself. So how will the flower be decorated? Will there be any little creases in there to make it look realistic? Will there be any echo? I normally echo every flower, and here I did only some. I just kind of forgot about it. So some are and some are not. And we'll talk more about that later. Here, see that vertical space above the flower? So I thought, well, let's just do a branch of leaves that reach up to the other leaves in the vase. And that seemed to work pretty well. I like the way that turned out. And leaves especially, you can make those go in any direction and all kinds of weird spaces and make them different sizes and stuff. So that's a lot of fun. See the space inside of where the handle attaches to the vase? I want to do something different in there. And then look at all the white space on the left. Let's go back to, see, we're going from the bottom up to the top. So let's keep working on that border. I can't do anything with the white space until that straight line echo is in place. One of the benefits of doing that is it's going to eat up some white space, so you've got less to quilt. And it just makes a nice division between this border and that border, and it frames the diamonds, and it's a straight line element, which I think this quilt needed. I could do only a few at a time, unless I was doing the top or the bottom. With the ruler base clamped onto the machine, I've got even less of a arm space to work with here, so I could only echo like 3 or 4 of these diamonds at a time. But that's plenty, because then I can stop and go back to doing flowers and backgrounds. And, I tried to make this as straight as possible, but I'm still just eyeballing it. I didn't do any math here. I didn't do any marking at all. If you need perfection, you probably want to quilt it yourself or find somebody who does perfect work. And I have no idea who that person would be, but it's not me. Okay, now let's make some more decisions. What am I going to do with these spaces? Does it need a little flower or a big flower, a partial flower? Does it not need a flower at all? Maybe it needs something else. That space is big enough. I think it needs a big old flower. See, I think if you treated every block as a different block, that would be limiting. But the drawback to this approach is all this stuff is just floating in the air. And maybe to somebody that's kind of weird. Thank goodness that in quilting we take all kinds of liberties. There's a lot of dense background quilting in here, but not everywhere. What I found with this quilt was there were a few places here and there where the presser foot was bouncing off of an intersection. The seam allowance, I mean. And also, if you say the seam has been pressed toward the light fabric, not the dark, which is going to happen here and there. If you quilt densely right on top of the seam allowance, you run the risk of getting a shadow that you've just now made more prominent. You can see the colored fabric seam allowance through the white fabric. So the combination of those two things had me kind of not quilting all the way to the edge with the little dense background quilting. Here, see, you have that buffer between the seam allowance and the background. So in this section, the background quilting will go all over the place. But in some other parts of the quilt, that's not the case. And here I thought it would be nice to have a little branch of leaves that curves around instead of just flower, 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 flower. So I like the way this looks. See what I mean about you can make the leaves go all sorts of places in all different directions? And if you've quilted leaves long enough, you can quilt them in all different directions from either angle. You don't have to start at the base or the reverse. Oh, that's pretty. Like. All right, in this part of the border, here are some prime examples of where the seam allowance is poking into the white space here. So you see where the background meets the partial diamonds and there is no echo, then I'm just trying to find a way to get that quilted adequately without having to do any little background quilting. So it's going to stop where it needs to stop. And that's kind of a confusing thing. So I need to be awake and remembering what the game plan is so I don't automatically violate the game plan. And in this part of the border, I chose to do this big rounded edge floppy flower, and those are the parts I'm echoing. And here I can't do more without backtracking a third time, so let's just get that little background done. And then when I background quilt all the way up to the point of that half diamond, then I can resume echoing that flower, maybe, if it ends up over there. Okay, so I quilted concentric lines in that big gold patch and liked it. I thought that would be just fine. It's kind of like the quilting in the diamonds. Simple, straightforward. And then what to do with this part here? I thought, well, let's just add more leaves to this vine as opposed to putting in a flower in here, because there's flowers everywhere. I thought it didn't really need them. And I guess in retrospect, I could have done something with those two overlapping circles. But nothing came to mind. I didn't like what the spacing was going to give me. So I opted just to do the leaves. And then when we go to the left of that dark green triangle, that's when we can resume doing some flowers. So those are the decisions you end up making. And I thought about putting some feathers in here, but this quilt just wasn't screaming for feathers. So I didn't, but you certainly could have. Or if you were going the geometric route, you could do all sorts of straight line things that would be so much work and take a lot of marking, and I didn't want to put a mark in this quilt. I wasn't sure if she had washed her fabrics or anything. I'm sure I asked her, but I don't remember. And being a show quilt, I have heard that the judges don't like when your quilt has been washed. So I'm not marking quilts. I don't even think I used a Hera marker on this quilt anywhere. It's like a little, it's a plastic thing with an edge, and you can sort of press on the fabric and it'll give you a temporary crease. So that's a way to mark without marking. And it's for the quilting you plan to do right this second, because that crease isn't going to last more than a few minutes. So that's a handy tool to have. A Hera marker, Hera. Back to our border. Okay, now see the white piece of fabric at the very edge of this quilt? The client sewed that on there so that the edge of the diamond border would not be a ripply bias affair. It was for stability, and there's a little bit of wiggle room in there, so I could maneuver around those diamonds, which I really appreciate. I mean, that was just a wise move all the way around. So when she got that quilt home, that strip is going to come off of there. And then she can bind it. So to expedite matters, I was quilting, see right past and then curve a little quilted line to get into the part that was going to have that flower, and I don't think you're even going to notice that I quilted my way in there to avoid a stop and a start. It's going to look like some kind of little, part of a vine or a stem or something. Okay. That was a lot of quilting. That took a long time for such a simple game plan. But it looks great. Look how the quilting leaps out of the quilt. Happy client. And go forth and tackle your own flowers with a little background for a huge payoff. Thanks for watching.